Well, good afternoon, education marketers of the internet. Thank you very, very much for joining us again. With new students getting stuck into registration events, freshers weeks, and settling into university life, we really want to put some focus on student retention. Student marketers, as admission teams, as student support services, what can we do to help students this year? And then also, what data do we have to support messaging and strategy? And then how do we use that data to retain students and build better student loyalty with institutions and their brands? So to kick us off, some introductions first. I'm Nick Wilmer. I'm Head of Education. I will be your host for this afternoon, and I specialise in pulling together insight and knowledge from across the sector and then feeding that into our content and also through to our client teams so they can improve marketing strategy. Over to you now.
Hi, I'm Nat Gould. I'm the Senior Researcher here at Natives. So I work in all things research. So I run surveys, focus groups, interviews, and analysing lots of third-party and sector-wide data for our clients and for the sector in general.
And lastly, hi everyone, my name's Julian Pereira and I'm the lead solutions consultant here at NetNatives. So my role is to provide those sort of consultative services in order to assist with the student recruitment. And in this case, talk about how that data and student journey mapping can really help you retain and sort of build that student loyalty.
Brilliant, thank you guys. Okay, what are we going to be covering today? So we're going to look at some of the challenges faced around retention within the sector, especially when it comes to marketing and comms teams and strategy teams that are looking at that particular challenge, how to use insights, how to find insights and data, and how to better understand the audience, and also ways to capture and utilize that data to inform better comms strategy for retention. So first thing, I'll look at the landscape. So where are we now? So leading up, so pre-COVID time, so we're sort of thinking pre-2020, feels like a long time ago now. There was already a lot of attention on dropout, on non-continuation than ever before. And that was really led by three main factors. So one was a regulatory shift, sort of move from having a director of fair access within HEFCE to a director for access and participation in a new OFS structure. And with governing bodies looking over both access and participation plans before submissions happen, that means there's a real focus on access, and that sort of that broadened to become access, retention, and progression as a bigger issue. Looking at resources within the sector, there was a squeeze on teaching income, so only one increase in like English home tuition fee cap since 2012. So income lost when a student departed earlier than expected, so that mattered more than ever before, and also the possibility of possible further freezes or even cuts to resources and funding. And metricization, almost couldn't say that, moving from sort of judging courses based on how the grads progressed and found jobs, but then sort of focusing on continuation as a data. So already being used by TEF, but was set to be built into OFS's new quality regime. So becoming a lot bigger focus leading up to COVID. Then the pandemic struck, and I remember making predictions early on, and especially sort of leading up to the sort of 2020 September start dates. Everyone was panicking about, we're going to have a huge dropout level. We've got students who are really unhappy with the current level of provision, unhappy with online learning, going into, potentially a bad place when they went to university, predicting there's going to be huge dropouts, and then waiting for it to happen, looking at the numbers, talking to universities, and it didn't happen. That big expected drop just didn't really occur. And I think the sad truth of the fact is that there was nothing else to do. There was a lack of alternatives. A potential university student can go traveling, a potential university student can get a job and do something else, but those options weren't there because of other impacts of COVID as well. So unfortunately, students were en route, and we're going to stay. Also, you had the increased grades from teacher assessment as well, and that meant that many more students were getting into their first choices and therefore also less likely to leave. So we get to 2021, and we're in a slightly different place now. So we're looking at staggered return arrangements, which could cause difficulties, with the ability to make friends or join social groups, or sort of starting courses at the same time as their peers, and potentially causing upset and dissatisfaction with study. Travel's opening up. Jobs are available in certain industries again. The economy's kick-started, so there's options there for students to go to if they're not happy with their course or with university or with the delivery they get. I think there's some real learnings from clearing this year. There was a lot of students that obviously got into their first place, but a lot of students that were available for clearing. They didn't get into their top choices, but ultimately didn't take up any available places, which may well have been a supply-demand issue, but also I think talked to quite a lot of disillusionment around HE study. And that also paired with looking at the academic experience survey, a real sort of shift in value perception around HE, and not having a great time during COVID, poor online provision potentially, and then also like a lack of value in what they were getting, sort of all lumped together, turned out to be a potential off-putter for students. So making another prediction this year, it could well be that this year we see a lot more dropout than last year and previous years, but don't hold me to it. If we were to look at sort of the wider picture, so look at other comparable developed countries, UK does have the best completion rates around. If you look at, this is bachelor's degrees compared to other developed countries, but way above the 39% average. Some may well say that's a positive thing. Quality of tuition and experience is superior. Some may also say that UK institutions are being too selective and not taking enough risks when it comes to who they enroll. So I'll let you be the judge, but that's where we are at the moment. And then looking at more granularly, looking at some of the segments there. So where are we seeing better retention and or worse non-continuation? Looking at non-continuation to after the first academic year here. And again, looking from 14-15 through to 18-19. So much lower dropout rates from younger students doing their first degree, relatively flat over that time period. A small decrease for the 2018-2019 cohort. Next on that list is mature students doing their first degree. However, that has been rising over the previous years, so some more dropout from that particular segment. And then the two segments that are sort of the ones that we see the most non-continuation from is from younger students and mature students who were doing other courses, second degrees, postgraduate degrees, or other courses. And then in 18-19, we saw that mature student audience peak and become the top of the list. So it'll definitely be interesting to look at 2019-2020 data when we get that data first, and whether or not they completed in the first year, and see whether how much COVID's had an impact on that and change the numbers. Sorry, I'm just going to go through these. Didn't realize that was a transition. So the looking at some of the individual audiences then. So which groups are more likely to drop out when we sort of delve down into the data? So firstly, if you look at gender, women have higher completion rates than men when we look at bachelor's program. There's actually an 11 percentage point gap difference between women and men in terms of continuing on, which is interesting. If we look at ethnicity, disadvantage, sexual orientation, and disability, documentation that's available shows that students from various minority groups, including disabled, BAME, LGBT+, mature and ex-BTEC students do drop out generally at a higher rate as well. Institution type, so if we look at OFS's figures, selective higher education institutions have lower non-continuation rates. Generally, higher tier universities have better continuation rates, and as high as 96.1%. I think Cambridge is still winning that at the moment. If we look at mode of study, so part-time students are considerably more likely not to complete than full-time students, and some online provision has particularly high non-completion rates as well. And also non-continuation rates differ according to discipline as well. And finally, looking at commuting time. So study that's gone into specific institutions in London, commuting time does prove to be a significant predictor of student progression, especially for England domicile full-time UG students as well. So the further away, the less likely they are to complete. So interesting there, looking at what audiences might need more support or more specific comm strategy and help to continue their studies. And then finally, I wanted to look at some of the more overarching challenges faced in retention or some of my recommendations for the best way to overcome these and set the scene for the rest of the webinar and the talk today. So if we look at first half there, so students have been through a lot over the last year and a half, a huge amount of uncertainty when it came to exams, if they were doing A-levels or they're doing university assessments, the ups and downs of 2020 A-level results and the stress that came with that, deferrals and movement of students going into higher tier and competitive courses, so not going to the university they wanted to and being paid to go somewhere else. And also now we've got staggered start dates and changes to teaching cycles. Again, not necessarily what they may have signed up for in the beginning. And we know that students weren't particularly happy with that move to online originally, and also around the communications they were getting around COVID from institutions as well. That combined with increased levels of stress and concerns around mental health, obviously with study combined with what was happening, was a big factor. And then you've got increased competition from new education providers in the sector. So online providers offering slick new online courses, combined with limited and reduced budgets, increased enrollment and graduation targets, and almost that continued unknown of what the pandemic could potentially bring. I mean, hopefully we're out of the woods to a certain extent, but there's still that level of unknown what happens as we go into Christmas and winter and into next year as well. So there's a lot there for universities and education institutions to do to keep students happy and to get them to stay. Some of the recommendations I thought were most important, and we'll touch on these as we go through the webinar as well. Firstly is around data. Use data better, use better data, survey students, talk to students, find out what their challenges are, find out what they want to hear about and how they want to hear it, and find out how they want to be communicated with as well. The more information we've got on the data on the students and their needs and wants, the better you can then target and segment and build comm strategies. So use that data to segment the groups and work out what each group needs from you, which ones are most likely to drop out as well, and then do build a personalized comm strategy for each of them. Understand your student journey better, so not just looking at pre-enrollment but post-enrollment through to graduation, and map out all the potential touch points and how we can improve that student experience at each stage as well. And then finally, I want to finish on this is creating a sense of belonging and connection to the institution, to their studies, to the community, and to their life at university. And if you help students to make connections with each other, with ambassadors, with other current students, with alumni, that's really going to help to build that sense of connection and ultimately help students continue and be happy at university. So that's all from me. I'm now going to hand over to Nat, who's going to take us through some more in-depth insights.
Great, thanks, Nick. So we're going to start by looking at some data that we've collected on our student pulse survey, which we'll talk about a little bit more about later, but wanted to start with this is prospective students, not current students. Sorry, I just realized the title on this is wrong. So started thinking about kind of what prospective students are saying, because obviously these are your future current students. What we've seen over 2020 is that students' perceived stress is much higher during August, which is not surprising given exams, given kind of results, and given getting into university. So we can see that really plays out there in how students are feeling across the year. And we can see there on the right, this graph shows kind of, we asked students, well, what's impacting your student wellbeing? So unsurprisingly there, we see stress about academic performance is the top stressor for students, but the pandemic and social isolation or loneliness are also really high up there for these students. So these are prospective students kind of feeling those worries at the moment before they're going to uni and before they're applying to university. Thanks, Nick. And what we also know from our data is that university communication is actually really important. So the university's communication is actually what students say most influence their decision alongside their family. And in our survey, we asked them, what do you most want to hear about and what are you hearing about from universities, to try and understand that gap? Is there content that students are really looking for but they're not actually receiving from universities currently? And this month, these were the top gaps that we found in our data. So Nick, I think it's the transition.
Oh, yep, sorry.
Sorry. So you can just go through them all if you like, and I'll say them. So Freshers Week is the top thing there's a gap about. So students are telling us that they really want to hear more about things like Freshers Week, sports and societies, and also well-being to do with university that they're not hearing about, alongside things like placements and internships, online learning provision, study abroad options, scholarships and financial aid, and career destinations of graduates. So these are the things where we're seeing the biggest gap for what students are looking for and what they're actually hearing about from university. So just something to think about with some content, kind of making sure prioritizing some of these areas alongside things like courses, which a lot of people are hearing about and want to hear about, which is great. So just closing some of the gap on the more kind of specific areas. And then we can move on to current students. So in a recent survey, we asked students how supported they were feeling by their university and how informed they feel about going back next term, so starting in September, October. We found that 1 in 5 students have felt unsupported by their university this year, and almost a quarter feel uninformed about what's happening next term, which shows that there's kind of that real kind of unrest out there at the moment about what's happening next and the uncertainty. Students told us that the top things that might help them were things like providing timetables and sending information earlier so they could prepare. And obviously it's been quite difficult this year with universities also being a bit on the back foot about what's happening. So that's appreciated, not always that easy. More frequent emails and communication and keeping them up to date on what's going on, along with information on the teaching format, whether it's going to be online or face-to-face or blended, would really help them to kind of feel like they knew what was happening next term. And this is leading on to a later part of the webinar really, but we also asked students how they'd like to be communicated with these updates. So lots of students say that actually returning they'd like to be talked to in person, so lectures or seminars, but also there's lots of different variation here, as you can see. So this graph is asking people what they'd like, how they'd like to be communicated, how they have been communicated, and how they wouldn't like to be communicated. And we can see that there are a lot of methods here that have lots of differing opinions, so showing the kind of value in really seeing and opting in for what communication methods they really would prefer, and that there's a lot of variation out there.
Transition slide again, I assume.
Yeah. So building on this, in the National Clearing Survey last year, we found that a third of students say that confidence is a barrier to going to university. And alongside that, actually 31% also said mental health was a barrier. 14% of current university students told us that they're feeling unconfident about returning to university next term. And 22% said that they're feeling unconfident about keeping up with the workload. So showing that there are kind of a fair proportion of students who are feeling kind of a lack of confidence about returning, a lack of confidence about being able to keep up, and generally that being a barrier to going to university, and something that could stop people going, but also stop people staying at university. So really thinking about how we can build their confidence and keep them updated and informed. And earlier on this year, University World News reported that 1 in every 5 students said they didn't have a real friend at university. So we were interested to ask our panel kind of how they felt about that. And we found fairly similar results. So 22% of students on our panel said they don't have one real friend at university. Almost half of university students said they felt isolated, and 39% said that their university could do more in helping them make friends. And there's some quotes there from some people in the survey, so talking about some ideas like helping to integrate them with other students, helping to spark friendships, and that those are things that really did help them, and including social events, even if they can't happen in person, but looking at online options and how to really help students feel less isolated and a sense of belonging and making friends with their peers, and really thinking about that in terms of helping them hopefully continue with their studies at the same time.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Now, is that everything? Awesome. Yeah, really interesting data there. I think, yeah, just there's definitely like a trepidation, isn't there, from students, and the concern around, knowing what's happened over the past year and a half and sort of going back into it now about what life is going to be like at university, almost like a level of unknown. So yeah, really interesting data. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, over to Julian next.
Thanks, Nick. So yeah, based on what we've covered so far, the current landscape and the insights, as well as your own data, how can that be used to improve that student experience? And firstly, if we go on to the next slide, we start with student journey mapping. So the mapping of your student journey can provide like a visual representation of each step a student takes even after they have enrolled. So an institution should essentially aspire to be student focused and consider the journey from the student's point of view. But secondly, it's about acting on that approach to design more effective and efficient services, processes, and channels for students to interact with. So this is linked to the earlier point of students feeling isolated, and the way an institution can help with that by offering support at the right time. So thanks to student journey mapping, as an example, introducing UniBuddy to help the student-to-student communications at an early stage. But also, institutions should also aspire to sort of better utilize the data to measure and improve the impact of these interactions in terms of key metrics like positive feedback and student engagement. What this allows is for you to identify the gap in the current process and start to understand what you know and you don't know about your students. So what this essentially means is that you're combining different departments and perspectives and taking a design thinking approach to the student experience. This then influences your decision-making based on what the inquiries and admissions teams have heard from students. And that can be from a variety of different channels. So interviews, workshops, surveys, and any other research, as well as the stuff that we've covered today. Student retention as well requires you to know the motivations and the engagement behaviors of those students. So for example, it's very important to address the potential choke points and bottlenecks of that post-enrollment journey and the interaction that those students are having with your institution. As an example, in this journey map on this slide, we have a clear visibility of the flow, so we can start to identify every stage within the journey. So for example, you identified that international students move from initial enrollment to attending a virtual event. But what are the exact stages and touch points in between those two phases, and how can you reduce that drop-off? This can then feed into your messaging and your communication channels and the content that you're sending, and it can be utilized to make for a sort of more personalized student journey. So it's important that your student journey map explores the exact mindsets that your prospective students have at each stage. So what excites them, what frustrates them. This process then allows you to sort of take the place of that student in those different touch points of the journey and give you an idea of their needs and their behavior, whether that is for domestic students or international. Some examples can be like the student needs. So what do they want to know or discover, or what information are they looking for? Is it personal feedback? Is it access to online resources? Is it course information or societies? And at which point of the journey should you communicate that with them? It can be about the student goals as well. So what do they want to achieve? Is it personal development or career advancement? Is it being part of a group? That then influences what actions they're doing. So are they downloading brochures? Are they speaking to student ambassadors? Are they attending a virtual event? Or it can be something as simple as just exploring your website, but you having that content available to them at the right time. What that then does is it improves that student experience and what they're feeling at that point. So if you find the right combination of an automated process and human interaction, that would allow you to sort of maximize the user experience and tackle those student anxieties. And then lastly, it's about the communication channels that you're doing that by. So where are they and how are those prospects engaging with you? And this is something that we'll cover shortly in the next slide. If you just go next, Nick.
Yep.
Perfect. So then the first thing that you need to think about is that first party data. So the data that you gather from your students is vital for the way that you can personalize your communications. So firstly, think about website analytics can allow you to discover who is landing on your pages, via what device, and from what source as well. So for example, if you identify that 50% of your students are reaching your landing pages via mobile device, you can then create a personalized SMS-centric journey based on the specific device that was used to access your page. This then means the effectiveness and content of each touch point you have with your students improves dramatically. In addition to that, we always recommend sort of having a multi-part form in your landing pages that allows you to ask questions in the second part, then you can later on use to personalize the student journey and increase the chances of retention. So if a lead only submits the first part of the form, you can still engage with them. But if they then submit more parts or provide you with more information from the get-go, you already have a more sort of comprehensive file about that person. And this initial data can then be used to better know your students and then divide them into specific groups from the get-go. You can then create audiences who are looking for specific advice and services, or are interested in a particular topic, such as sports or music, or an online resource at your disposal that they might otherwise wouldn't be aware of. What that does is it enables you to create highly personalized messages and increase the effectiveness of your communications post-enrollment. On the next slide, Nick, please. So progressive profiling. It doesn't mean that you have to sort of affect the performance of your forms by including an endless amount of questions at the beginning. What you can also do is progressive profiling, which as the word sort of suggests, it refers to a user profile that gradually progresses and grows. So it's the tactic of repeatedly asking questions to your students in your nurture communications over a period of time, and later optimizing your communication strategy based on those needs of those subscribers. So that data that you are gradually collecting adds more relevance to your email marketing campaigns and can be of relevance for a long-term or short-term marketing strategy. So in terms of long-term data, thanks to progressive profiling, that can help with the relationship with your student over the whole university experience. So information like birth date, interests, worries, plans, or ambitions, which you can then personalize in terms of communication over a long period of time. But it's also in terms of short-term data. So this is preferably collected during certain stages, and that can also be beneficial. So it contains very specific questions that can help towards highly relevant and targeted emails or channels of communication. So as an example, asking for the plans for Christmas or the summer period, what that does, it shows that as an institution, that prospect is more than just a number, because you've been very personalized with the way that you're communicating with them. So thanks to that first party data and the progressive profiling, if we go on the next slide, that leads into that sort of long-term nurture strategy. So once you have that data at your disposal, consistency is key in your student communications. If you are to build a positive relationship with your students, you need to contact them when they expect you to, as well as to not include content which doesn't relate to them to the point of disengagement. So what this means is that being consistent with both the content and delivery of your messages will ensure your student base feels valued, and crucially, it establishes a layer of trust between both of you. Consistency will also enable you to boost the nurturing process, but educate your prospects and convert those who otherwise might be dropping off. And also via automation, it will raise your profitability by cutting time and labor costs, something that we'll also cover in the following slide. But it's also worth mentioning that educational institutions involve students, they involve parents, teachers, and staff. So channels must be implemented so you can interact with all members of this community and build on relationships and establish that aforementioned trust. So in addition to marketing content, there are other reasons as to why a communication strategy needs to be in place. So this includes delivering urgent alerts and notifications. So for example, timetables or last minute changes to courses, or delivering timely reminders to parents and students about upcoming events, but also implementing, as an example, a mobile communication channel in emergency plans, something that has become a priority due to the sort of events that have occurred over the last 18 months. What I'm trying to say is today's students have more options and higher expectations than ever before when it comes to the way they interact with your institution. So they are technologically savvy and they use key interactive channels. So email, mobile, social media, and the web practically simultaneously. So each channel that you offer can be used for different purposes, and they can all complement each other to achieve an overall strategy. So as another example, by regularly promoting your services available for new students to access peer support, You can then use your data along with the information covered earlier in the webinar to build a comprehensive communications plan across multiple channels, which then leads us on to the next slide, which is about automating that nurture communication. So even if you only implement semi-automation and only for your most repetitive admin tasks, this can significantly save you time. So this will give teams more time to spend working with students. For example, automating communications and scheduling calls with student counselors can help prioritize prospects who need the most attention. Or automatically sending a birthday message to your students without having to remember any dates goes a long way. Marketing automation is a way for you to sort of replicate your human interactions and engagement wherever possible. And once you set it up, it runs virtually hands-free. And when it comes to good marketing, nothing works better than some sort of friendly, personalized communications with current and prospective students asking for referrals or offering additional services. And this can all be automated for you. This kind of unique, personalized communications experience can give your university an edge over the competition and make students feel like, as mentioned before, an individual and not just a number. Which then leads on to integrations. So integrating the data about your users from various sources. So that can be website, it can be surveys, it can be your advertising, your events, or your CRM data. Having a well-defined tech stack helps improve your institution's efficiency. So this integrated approach helps prevent the repetition of tasks. So also, when your technology is disconnected and poorly configured, you can run the risk of annoying your students and providing a poor experience for them. Integration is the sort of best practice for streamlining your work, and it will save you time in the long run. It will help in ensuring that you have one source of format or truth for all your data. So for example, our marketing automation platform, Akira, has a variety of different features that can assist with your student recruitment. And can be easily and directly integrated with your CRM. As an example, workflow automation, email and SMS functionality, creation of landing pages, and also our insights section that we covered earlier in the webinar, where you can find updated student data to inform your student communications. As another final example, Akira can integrate with UniBuddy. This means that your UniBuddy leads can then be automatically sent follow-up communications, and they can already be placed in segments that can be used for future campaigns. So that's the sort of importance of integrating your whole tech stack. So do get in touch if you would like to find out more information on how to implement any of that. Cheers.
Brilliant. Wizardry. Yeah, that's yeah, the thing that I always talk about is that importance of personalization. I think gone are the days where students are happy just to receive that the standard email, the standard piece of post, where there's not something that identifies them as a human, with their own choices. So the more personalized you can make that messaging and that content strategy, the better conversion you're going to have throughout, and the better, more happy students you're going to have. So brilliant. Thank you so much for that. So interesting. So just to wrap us up then, in terms of key takeaways for the day, I'll leave you with, I think it's 6 points altogether. So going back to my original point, segmentation and targeting, using data to work out which groups you should be looking at, which ones need the most attention, and then what kind of communication strategy is going to work with each of those individual segments the best. Building that connection. So we talked about UniBuddy, we've talked about connecting to ambassadors and connecting to other students. How do you create a sense of belonging and community, potentially when you might be in an online environment as well, is really important to making sure that students, that stay and are happy. Making sure comms are delivering the information that students want to know more about. So everything that Nat was talking about in terms of the most important factors that are going on in their lives, but also their sort of personalized demands and motivations and barriers, making sure the comms are revolving around that and supporting and answering the questions they want. Helping students feel confident and not allowing them to be isolated on their own with no friends at university, keeping them informed and keeping them understanding what the situation is in terms of COVID and delivery, and helping them to make friends. The importance of first-party data, so capturing first-party data and quality data right at the initial source through some of the some of the channels and some of the tactics that Julian was talking about there. And then, like we said, building that into a personalized journey for a prospect or for an applicant or for a current enrolled student. And then keeping the message consistent, so we've got, we do have silo teams here. We've got marketing teams, admissions teams, and recruitment teams, and student support teams, and everyone getting involved, and making sure that that on-brand message and that level of communication and the tone of voice and everything runs through that journey, so that students don't feel jarred by the experience. They feel like they know who they're speaking to, and they've got that sense of belonging, and also automating it to save you time as well. So brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to that. I thought it was really interesting. We've already had a couple of questions, but this is now your opportunity to ask any other questions you might have to any of the panelists today, either on the insights we've got or some of the tech options we've got, or challenge me on my knowledge of the sector, which I may or well not know. But we're going to just go offline now for a minute or two, just to have a look at the questions that have come through, and we're back online in about a minute, and we'll answer the questions that do come through. Okay, thanks a lot. And we are back. I'm going to welcome my panelists back to the floor to answer some questions, some tough questions from the audience. Thank you very much for everyone who sent one through. Firstly, Charlene, yes, the session will be shared after this as well, so everyone will get access to the full recording afterwards, in case anyone's had any difficulties with internet connections. I know that's one of the sort of realities of living in Zoom land. We have got a question from Brandon asking about I suppose the same situation in terms of sort of retention and conversion of students, but from a US angle. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Brandon. This was a very UK focused webinar through a UK lens, and the data that we pulled came from Student Pulse, which again was focused mainly on the UK student audience. However, Julian does have some experience in working with US clients. So Julian, are you okay to share some of your insight from what you've done so far?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, as Nick mentioned, we work with a variety of US clients, and we've done some recent email nurture strategies with them. And we find from student feedback that it's a lot about having the connection or the ability to be able to speak to admissions ambassadors or just overall student ambassadors. Or we find works quite well sending emails as if from like the dean to provide that figure of authority to sort of tackle some of those student anxieties. Or communications as if they were coming from the student ambassador group, because we find that a lot of students, when it comes to speaking to another student, they feel a lot more free and open to speak about more sort of serious topics, and they can relate to them a lot more. But it's also in terms of within your email nurture, providing access to those societies, those groups, as well as things that might not be directly related to the institution. So for example, A lot of these students will be moving to a new city, so providing the sort of tips or the best places to go around the campus, and those sort of things can really go a long way towards making that student feel welcomed, and keep them sort of that retention to throughout the year, sending them relatable communications and emails that have content that they can then use throughout the year. So places to go, things to do.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Julian. Hopefully that answers part of the question, Brandon. What I will say is that we are looking into pulling similar insights for the US as well. So they'll be shared in a timely manner once we have that insight as well. But in the meantime, I will ask one of the US team who focus purely on US students to get in touch with you, and they'll be able to go through some knowledge that they've got from the team out in New York. Brandon does have one more question, and Julian, you might be able to answer this as well. But when using SMS communications, have you noticed anything when it comes sort of negatives or positives, I suppose, around pushing out transactional comms compared to pushing out informational comms? And what works for each channel the best, do you think?
I mean, specific to SMS, we find that it works really well for time-based communications. So you can still automate that process, but SMS works really well, for example, as reminders on the day for students to attend an event. So for example, based on some benchmarking data that we've done with Akiro, we find that student is much more likely to open an SMS within 5 minutes of receiving it, as opposed to them checking their emails 2 or 3 times a day. So if there's an upcoming webinar in a couple of hours time, they're much more likely to open that SMS and be reminded of it. In terms of emails, although one-off emails are still sometimes necessary to respond to specific questions, there are a lot of things that you can automate. So as mentioned earlier, for example, scheduling with counselors, for example, to have meetings with them, or those similar, for example, overall webinars, those sort of things can still be automated via email. One thing to think about in terms of the call to action is to think about, so if they're opening an SMS, have a call to action that maybe leads to a phone number to call, whether it's if it's an email, maybe a different call to action. And as mentioned before, if you have the marketing automation tools that lets you know how those students are accessing your landing pages, you can then have that landing page be optimized for that specific device and have a specific call to action for depending of the device that they use for that.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. Really, hopefully that answered the question. Like I said, Brandon, if I will get one of the US team to follow up with you directly, and they can share their knowledge from that side. Nat, I think a question for you. It's a question around almost like where to go first. Where would I start if I wanted to understand student audience, and what kind of data sources are there available?
Interesting. So I think what we often say here is a kind of, I guess, 3-pronged approach really. So firstly, understanding what data is already out there in the sector. We all know there's lots of data out there. So looking to sector-wide data sources, things like HESA, things like NCES, also our student polls. So as we've mentioned, our student poll survey is asking students on our panel. So we ask them the same questions each month for our student polls dashboard, but then monthly we ask them questions about things that are happening at the moment, and really try and get onto the trends of what's happening. So to find out things around, for example, student safety on campus, or what they're doing for summer, or how they're feeling about going back to uni. So quite a range of topics that we kind of try and ask each month to understand how students are really feeling about those things that are happening much more kind of on the nose rather than over time. So partly understanding what's already out there in the sector. I think then really understanding your own data. So we work with clients both in the UK and the US, helping them to analyse their CRM data. So really looking at who their audience are, particularly around where they're coming from. So whether that's what countries they're coming from, or what areas of the UK, or which states in the US, and really helping them understand where there might be potential for where they might be losing people. So are there particular areas where they have huge numbers of applicants that don't then come through to being students, and kind of understanding that student journey at the very start there, and also looking at what data you're collecting there in your CRM. Could you be collecting any motivational data to understand a bit more about what's happening, collecting data on people who are declining, and then really following that student through the student journey. So reaching out to your audience, I think, is really important. So running surveys with your students to find out how they're doing, what they're looking for, what's missing for them, and really reaching out kind of to your primary audience, as well as looking at the data that you already have. So I would say looking at the sector data, looking at your own kind of data that you're collecting, but then also reaching out to your audience in surveys, focus groups, interviews, whenever you can, really, to hear that student voice.
Brilliant, thank you. One final question. Julian, people are very interested in progressive profiling. I don't think I'd heard about it until 20 minutes ago, so I'm really excited to hear more about it. But when it comes to sort of starting that journey, what sort of questions should you be asking, as you start progressive profiling and asking students questions?
Sure, I think it directly relates to how that student journey mapping is. So identifying those sort of touch points that you're having with your prospective students or your current students. And then from that point on, working out what questions you need to ask so you get more information to act on those touch points. So for example, a multiple choice question regarding interests would allow you to easily segment by those answers and then send targeted communications based on those interests. Or for example, and this is going back to having a sense of belonging, asking a question about societies that they're interested in, and in that way you can send personalized communications regarding that. As another alternative, if their preferred method of contact has changed, then if you're asking that question later on, this then gives you an indication of how to interact with them and have an updated way of communicating with them. So those sort of questions in terms of progressive profiling, because you're asking them as you go along, it allows you to continuously optimize those communication channels and the content that you send them out.
That's awesome. Thank you. Really interesting stuff. Okay, I think that's it for questions for the day then. So what I'm going to do is just what's next steps for everybody. So firstly, Student Pulse, with a nice new logo there. So the data that Nat was running you through, a lot of that came from NetNative Student Pulse. For those of you who don't know what it is, so it's a monthly survey to hundreds of prospective and current students. We analyse trends in decision making, student well-being, motivations, barriers, media use, the lot, and we measure it over time. So we know how things are increasing or decreasing, and it's a perfect tool if you're thinking about who to target, what segments to go after, what messaging is most important, building content for either prospective students or current students, and the best thing is it's free for the sector, so anyone anywhere at the moment can get a login to Akiro and they can access the data. So please do. I think we've dropped a link into the chat box. Join Student Pulse. If you give us the details, we'll give you a login and you can go in there and play with the data to your heart's content. Also, if you want to know anything more than is currently in the data set, send some questions through. If you want to ask students other things that we're not asking them, then please do send them through and we can include them in November and December trend reports that come out. So what do you want to know? We can find out for you. If you do want to speak to Julian separately about how you can build those incredible personalization, nurture workflows and tactics, either using Akira or using your own systems, then please do get in touch and we'll be able to put you in touch with someone who can help. And then finally, Think Student Live is coming to you in a hybrid format, so both in person and online on the 11th of November this year. So God willing, we'll be there in person together, celebrate together and go through some really incredible insights with some guest speakers that are still to be announced. But if I think, again, we've dropped a link into the group where you can sign up now and look for availability of tickets. So yes, please do so. I'm very much looking forward to that. And then finally, just to say a big thank you. So thank you to all our panelists today. Thanks to our speakers, incredible insight and knowledge. And thank you to everyone who has attended and listened today and asked questions and engaged. It's been brilliant. And I look forward to seeing everyone again at Think Student Live in a couple of months. So I'll take this time to say goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye.